It's coming. You might not be able to see me behind the screen here, but I gotta move away. And I'm Joe Lombardo, a member of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. I'm also the co-coordinator of the United National Anti-War Coalition, which is a national coalition of peace and justice groups of about 160 groups nationally.
Joe, could you speak into the mic?
About 160 groups nationally. Bring it up a little bit more. And we were part of a delegation. I was part of a delegation that went down to Venezuela. It was supposed to be a week-long delegation, but it actually ended up being about 2 weeks. I'll explain a little bit about the delegation first. These are the delegation members. I've been on other delegations to other places before. Oh, it wasn't turned on. That's the problem. And this was a little different. It was organized by the U.S. Peace Council, and there was a number of other anti-war groups from the United States. All of them are member groups of UNAC. And I'll try to, but rather than just inviting everybody, we tried to get kind of leaders of the various groups so they could go back and hopefully use their organization from their group to spread the word about what's going on in Venezuela. So I'll try to introduce the people as I go across. The woman on the far left is the first name is escaping me, her last name is Delou, and she is the president of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom U.S. section. The man next to her is Jamal Baraka. He was the vice presidential candidate of the Green Party in the last election. He's also the president of the Black Alliance for Peace, which is a new group that just celebrated its 2nd anniversary, a very significant group that in the black community there's a peace organization being organized. The woman behind him is Eva Bartlett. Eva Bartlett is an independent journalist. She actually has joint U.S. and Canadian citizenship. The man next to her is the head of the Canadian Peace Congress, which is the major peace group in Canada. The next two people is Margaret Flowers and Kevin Zeese, and they together coordinate a group called Popular Resistance. The man at the podium is Venezuelan, who was introducing us. This was at one of the press conferences we did. We did a ton of press conferences and got tremendous media. The man whose head my hair is hiding is sorry, names are escaping me right now. He's the president of Veterans for Peace. The person who with the hair is me, UNAC. The person next to me is Bayman Azad. He is the General Secretary of the U.S. Peace Council. The man next to him is Dan Shea. He is on the board of Veterans for Peace. The woman in the red is Sarah Flounders. She's a member of a group called International Action Center. And the woman at the end is also Sarah Martin. And she is from Minneapolis and a leader of a group called Women Against Military Madness. So this was our delegation. I'm sorry, we're just trying to see if we could live stream it because it's the presentation. Together a series of slides today, if I can figure out how to, let's see. Yeah. Just a street scene in Venezuela. I took a lot of street scenes, just put a couple there. One of the reasons is, one of the things we saw down there was the narrative that you were getting in the U.S. media about what's going on in Venezuela I'm going to say diplomatically and not as strong as it could be said. It is a total 100% lie. It has nothing to do with what's going on in Venezuela. Just to think propaganda, like U.S. propaganda, was meaning you slanted things in your direction so you get people to believe it. The propaganda we're seeing out of the U.S. media today is a total lie. One of the things they are saying is people in Venezuela are starving, that there is no food, there's a lot of repression that's going on, that everybody's against the government. The government of Maduro is a dictatorship, he is corrupt, and much, much more. What we found was that people looked fairly well dressed and well fed. There was at points food crises. Some of that was due to the sanctions. Some of that was due to the fact that most of the agriculture is still in private hands, and the large plots of land and the large farms and ranches, generally the owners are against the process that's going on in Venezuela. And so a lot of food was being taken out of the country or sold on black markets, and they've been trying to stop that in various ways. They made it mandatory that a certain percentage of all food grown within Venezuela has to be sold in Venezuela. They also made it, they started a land reform program so that land that was not being grown on was taken over by small peasants and farmers. And it's created a lot of controversy, a lot of conflict in the rural areas, and 300 of the land reform organizers have been killed so far by hired right-wing goon squads that have been done by these. They also have been doing something called urban agriculture, and I'll explain that a little bit more. That's just another street scene. This is not, I didn't really do that. We're going to come back to that. There's two videos I wanted to show. I kind of bring up a browser and put it in there, but I didn't get a chance to do that. The first one was various people in our delegation talking about what we saw as opposed to what we were hearing on the news. It's very interesting to see the difference. We got there during the blackout that was taking place. There were several blackouts. It was basically a 3-day blackout. Each day a little bit more of the electricity came on. After 3 days, they pretty much got it back on. Then another blackout. And so they were investigating these blackouts. The U.S. narrative, of course, was, well, they didn't never maintain their system, it's inefficiency and quote-unquote socialist government, and so they're causing these blackouts. So they did a forensic analysis with the help of China and traced the blackouts. There was some local sabotage, cutting of wires and things like that that took place within Venezuela. But the main problem was viruses that were introduced into the system. Now you have to understand, a country like Venezuela, or most any country in the world that's not one of the advanced capitalist countries, relies on the advanced capitalist countries for their electoral system, to buy components, to buy major pieces, and their system was basically built by the United States and Germany, two countries that are supporting the sanctions. So even if they didn't maintain the system, they tried to maintain the system, they couldn't maintain the system because they can't get parts for the system. But that was not the reason for the blackouts. They were able to trace the blackouts to viruses that took place, and Maduro himself explained this to us. We had an opportunity to meet with Maduro, it was a very interesting meeting, to Houston, Texas and Chicago. That viruses were introduced into their system from that, and that caused the blackouts. But still, within 3 days, they were able to get them back on. I understand yesterday was another blackout that they did. But you know, you compare that to Puerto Rico after the hurricane. It took the United States 11 months to get the electricity back on. And you know, no one even thought of the possibility of invading the United States over it. And yet they talk about invading Venezuela. So again, here's our delegation, and this man over here with the nice-looking short haircut and suit is the foreign minister. We had unprecedented access to any government official. They basically said, anybody you want to talk to, anybody you want to interview, we'll set it up for you. Our delegation was hosted in Venezuela by a group called COSI, which is not a government group, but it is an independent group, which sometimes actually is critical of the government, and it stands for Committee for International Solidarity. They hosted us, but the government said to them, you have access to what you want. They really think the anti-war movement in the United States is very important, and they understand the narrative that's happening, and they wanted to get the word out in the United States as much as possible. So this is the foreign minister. He's in the paper just about every day. He's in different countries trying to organize trade deals and so forth, because the sanctions make it extremely difficult. Basically, the major markets in the world they cannot trade with. Even their oil, it's difficult to trade. They have the greatest oil reserves of any country in the world, but it's a very thick oil, and even to transport it, they have to mix it with other oil, and so they have to get other oil from other countries, and the U.S. is trying to block that. There are some countries that are not going along with the sanctions, which are helping them a lot, including Russia and China, and some others. So the sanctions are hurting them, and this man has been going around the world trying to make trade deals to get around some of the sanctions. This is another woman we met with. She is an economist from the Caracas University, and basically we asked to speak with an economist because we want to figure out what's going on with the economy, with the sanctions, how it affects them, and also the high inflation rate, how it does. So she went into a real long explanation of the inflation rate, and basically it has to do with the sanctions. I mean, what's happening is, besides the sanctions, meaning people can't trade with them, and they can't trade with other countries, most other countries, the major markets that they used to trade with, they've frozen all their assets in foreign banks, and they have a lot of money, billions and billions of dollars in foreign banks. So Citibank, which has billions of Venezuelan dollars, billions of dollars in Venezuelan assets, because that's where the Citco gas stations, and they also have refineries in this country, that's where all that money goes. It's been frozen. They basically just stole it. Some of it they're given to this guy Guaido as the opposition leader, and some of it they're just freezing. Most countries that have gold, and they have the third highest reserves of gold in the world also, the international protocols are that you store your gold in the Bank of London, because the Bank of London has programs that deal with people's gold from around the world. So most gold-producing countries put their money there. So they have billions of dollars in gold in the Bank of London. It's frozen. So a lot of their money is frozen. Money they needed to buy things with, and money they needed to help with their programs for the people of Venezuela, and that money wasn't available. So basically the money that was available gets an inflated value to reach up to that amount, and it was inflating at a very big rate. Plus, because of shortages due to the sanctions and due to some of the sabotage by the big capitalists within the country, it developed a black market. So if you can't get goods because they were withholding goods from the market, you can get them in the black market, but the black market prices is inflated. So this inflates the process. And so they've had a big problem getting, dealing with the inflation process that was there. In this country, they would tell you because it's socialism. In but has nothing to do with sanctions. This woman is the head of the Electoral Commission. We wanted to speak with people about the elections because we were told the elections were unfair and that they were corrupt and that Maduro would win. Well, they have an incredible electoral system in Venezuela, and the head of their Electoral Commission is an elected position. And just like we have 3 parts of government, they actually have 5. Equal parts of government. One of them is the Electoral Commission, so it's independent of any political party. And this woman was elected, and she is the head of it. And they made certain rules that were then passed by their legislative bodies and so forth, including that half the people put up as candidates have to be women. So that was one piece of it. But she explained their electoral process. First of all, it is in the Constitution that everybody has a right to vote. That's not in the American Constitution. In this country, you know, especially the Republicans have been trying to deny people the right to vote, trying to make it more difficult, fewer polling places in the poorer communities, long lines, telling that you've been arrested and had a felony, you can't vote. If you remember the Florida situation, they took people, all they had was names of people. They didn't have their addresses or anything, so Jim Smiths from black communities and so forth were just knocked off the ballot. They made it very difficult. Here, it is mandatory that the government make it as easy as possible for people to vote. So they have polling places all over. In the kind of areas which used to be called shanty towns, what happened throughout the whole process in Latin America, many places, because Latin America has basically been a poor area, rural people came to the cities to look for jobs, and around many of the cities, these shanty towns developed. When Chavez came into power, he said, well, we're making these shanty towns part of each city, and therefore it is mandatory that they get city services. So rather than dirt roads, they now had to pave roads. They had to put sewers in, they had to put water in, they had to put electricity in. They made them part of the cities. And one other thing they did was crash housing project. Since 2016, they have built 2.5 million housing units. They expect to be at 3 million housing units for the poor people from these shanty towns to move into and live. And I'll show you, I have a picture of some of them. But they also mandated that they have to be able to vote. It's the first time these people ever had any opportunity to vote. So they went around and they registered. And this flipped a lot of their electoral process in many, many ways, because these people who are getting the benefits of the process in Venezuela are very strong Chavistas, very strong people from Maduro right now. And so it flipped a lot of the process that was going on there. And so besides having the voting places, and besides going around and registering everybody, they wanted to make sure the elections are fair. So they have voting booths like we do, electronic voting booths. You can push down for who you want to vote for, but they have a paper backup for each one. And it is mandatory that after the elections, which are held on Sunday, not on Tuesday, because they want people to be able to vote when they're not working, they have in every polling place 58% of the ballots, ballot boxes selected randomly have to go through a process where they match the paper ballot and the electronic ballot to make sure that it is correct. These are the elections that our government is saying were unfair. In the last election, they had a higher turnout of the electorate than we did, and much more of their population is registered voters than percentage of our population. And they had a higher percentage of that turnout for the elections, and Maduro got about 70% of the vote. This is the election that they say was unfair. We went through this process, and there's some other pieces to the election we can go over, and some things that happened, and some fighting that went on around that, and some of the opposition decided not to run. Guaido was going to run, but Guaido, who the U.S. has designated as the real president there, the opposition is many parties, and he is one of the smallest parties, but one of the most fervent white nationalist right-wing parties. A lot of the upper middle class white people there don't call themselves Venezuelan, they call themselves Spanish, because Venezuelan is almost a dirty name. But the majority of people are some combination of Afro-Venezuelan or indigenous or mestizo, which is a combination of the races, and have darker skin. And these are the people, the darker the skin, that have traditionally been disenfranchised. And Maduro and Chavez come from that group. And it was an outrage to some of the more wealthy people.
Speak up a little bit.
All right, I'll try to speak up. Sorry. Here's Maduro. We met with him. That's Kevin Zeese from our delegation, Eva Bartlett, Sarah Martin. The head over there is Sarah Flounders. There's a little bit of Jamal Baraka. He gave us each of these books in Spanish about the history of war and revolution, and so forth. We spoke to him for 90 minutes. No cameras were in there. It was him, his 20-something-year-old son, who speaks very good English, his wife, and some other government officials, and us, 13 of us. And he spoke for a while, and then just asked me anything. And we asked him anything we wanted. He showed us 2 tweets he had on his phone. One was from Marco Rubio. And what it was a picture of Gaddafi dead in the street. Gaddafi, it was clearly a threat. Another one was from Elliot Abrams. The guy's a criminal. And he tweets him, and he basically says in the tweet, if you leave and let the opposition in, we will make sure you're safe. And we will give you the option of, in a few years down the line, running for office again. This is the pledge they were trying to make to him. He was also told us, tried to show us some of the evidence they had of what was happened with the blackouts. Now, his history is he was a bus driver. And when Chavez came in, he tried to get the working class into politics, something different than you see here. And he got involved. He got involved in the National Assembly. And before when he was in the National Assembly, he actually was in the United States. Some of us actually saw him several months ago, because when the General Assembly was happening in New York, leaders of various countries come, and he was at Riverside Church with the president of Cuba, and he spoke for a little while. But before he was the leader of Venezuela, when he was just in National Assembly, he had done a tour of the United States to try to help spread the word about what the Bolivarian Revolution was about. One of the places he went to was Boston, and there's United Steelworkers Local something or other, which organizes school bus drivers, organized a meeting for him, and he spoke to them. So we told him when we were there that we were organizing a demonstration in Washington, D.C. on March 30th, and the bus drivers were organizing a bus from Boston to come down to it. And he remembered the bus drivers. So I said, I want to go and I want to drive the bus to go down. We had a very good and friendly discussion with him, and he made it clear that they can threaten him all they want, and he knows he's in danger, and he knows he's going up against the most powerful country in the world that has invaded and done regime change in one place after the next, and has troops in 172 countries around the world, and has a military budget almost as big as the rest of the world combined. He knows that, and he knows it's a difficult process, but he is not going to turn his back on the Venezuelan people who are moving forward. When we came out of his meeting with him, we ran into this. What this was an occupation. Remember, like Occupy Wall Street? This was an occupation, but it was of a different kind. It was on February 13th, when February 23rd, when Guaido was trying to get this truck of supposed aid from the United States. And imagine that. Imagine what country would ever allow a truck into their country where they can't even investigate what's in it. It could be an atom bomb, it could be weapons, it could be anything. And they said, well, it's humanitarian aid, we're not going to give it to you, Guaido's going to bring it in, he's going to... No country in the world would do that. And you know the whole story that happened, the truck caught on fire on the bridge, and they blamed it on Chavez, on Maduro. But then the New York Times had the videos, and it showed one of the Guaido supporters throwing a Molotov cocktail, and it landed on the truck, and the truck caught on fire, and that whole story fell through. Another billionaire was organizing on the Colombia side of the border a big concert in the hope that people would come from Venezuela and other places, and they could use this as the beginning of a coup of some kind. But hardly, despite the fact that he got the biggest acts throughout Latin America, not too many people showed up. Very few people showed up for the concert. But on the Venezuelan side, thousands and thousands showed up because they were afraid that they were going to make a coup. And they were going to stand there and stop any coup that was going to happen. So on the 23rd, they started this occupation, and now it was into its second week. And basically what it is, it's around the presidential palace and if anybody tries to come to attack the palace, these people intend to stand in the way of it. And who are these people? Different groups take the occupation for different times. So a women's organization will come, and they will occupy for a period of time, 24 hours. Then a trade union would come, and they would occupy. And then a community group would come, and they would occupy and relieve. When we were here, this is the oil workers union that was there. And we walked in there, just, it wasn't planned or anything like that. And they said, well, who are you? And I said, we're an American anti-war delegation. We're here to express solidarity and to push for peace within our country, make sure there's no war. And they started cheering, and they brought us up there one after the other. We each had to give a talk and say something, and then they cheered like crazy. I thought the next picture was this one guy who was a leader of the Oil Workers Union, because after I spoke, he spoke next, and he came up and gave me this big hug, and then whispered in my ear. He said, "We're not just oil workers," he said. "We are armed oil workers. We are an armed population, and if the United States thinks it's going to come here, they're going to be surprised." This is the housing units I talked about. They built these housing units all over the place. They're usually these high-rise apartments, and they put the people from the shanty towns into them. And they always have some political message going on. So if you read this one on the bottom, it says Oscar Lopez Rivera. Oscar Lopez Rivera, you might have known, was a Puerto Rican political prisoner who spent decades in the prisons here, was recently released for a while, lived in New York, but now has gone back to Puerto Rico. So this particular housing unit was named after him. These kind of housing units in different colors like this, blue and red and things, with these murals on the side, and it's a place for of government supporters in these housing units. These are cable cars. As I mentioned, in the surrounding areas around the shanty towns developed and so forth, Caracas is surrounded by mountains. So as they came to Caracas to try to find jobs and things, people, and built these shanty towns, they built them up the mountains. And the higher up the mountains, the poorer the people were, really. So what they did was they built these cable cars. So it's the first kind of time that, besides walking down dirt roads and sometimes a rickety bus that would go up there, that they had good transportation between these areas on the mountains that have now been incorporated into the cities, and the city has brought, you know, the water and services to them. So we took a ride on one of these cable cars and went up the mountain and back down. They all have names of some meaning, you know, social etiquette, I think that one is. I'm not a Spanish. But anyway, then when they come down, people leave, and they go over here where there's a door to the subways. The subways are free in Venezuela because they want people to get around. Gas is free. If you have a car in Venezuela and you drive into a gas station, you take the handle off the pump, you put it in your car, and you fill up your car, you put it back in the pump, and you go away. It's free. Something I'm sure the oil companies dislike. This was some of the urban farming. This actually was at a co-op in one of the areas that was one of the poorest areas. And they have every one of these communities have these community councils with like several blocks is a community council. And then like 10 community councils form a commune. And they all try to grow their urban food. They do urban gardens, they do greenhouses, they do rooftop gardens. And one of the things it does is it means you don't have to transport far the food. So the food's right there. Since a lot of the people came to the cities from the rural areas, there was a lot of expertise in the city on how to grow things. They don't use pesticides. Part of the reason is because of sanctions, but they don't want to use pesticides. They do it. We spoke with the Minister of Urban Agriculture. They do things they call companion plants, where they try to have a plant that bugs that like this one plant and don't like the smell of this other plant, and it basically keeps them away. And right now, 25% of the food for the entire country is from these urban agricultural projects, and they're trying to raise it to 50%. This is one of the big Maduro demonstrations we went on. They're doing them pretty much every Saturday. But that's not the only mobilizations that happen. There's continual mobilizations like that occupation thing that was going on. In every community, there's different kinds of activity that are going on. And they call all of these organizations, and this is their People's Power organizations and People's Power mobilizations. And this is one of the mobilizations that we were on. We went on a pro-Maduro demonstration. And you just, as far as the eye can see, backwards and forwards, there were people. Now, one of the narratives we were hearing here is, yes, they have big demonstrations, but people were forced to go on the demonstrations. These are the people that were forced. It's just not true. I mean, one of the videos I wanted to show, maybe I can show it if we have a couple minutes at the end, was some of the people talking to us on these demonstrations. These demonstrations, it's like there's people dance, people march, people chant, they run forward, they hold their fists in the air, they feel the strength of the people when they have these demonstrations, and they come out, week after week to do these things. There's another picture of the Rocha Vista demonstrations, people forced. This was a banner on the demonstration we went on. This was Eco-Socialists for Maduro. I like the banner, so I made that. While we were there were two opposition demonstrations called. Now, the opposition has been strong. It was big. I'm not saying it wasn't big. At one point, they took over many streets. They were very, very violent. When they see especially a dark-skinned person, they would attack them. Some were burnt alive. Cops were killed. They set up roadblocks. We met with a couple of left parties that were supportive of the process, but considered themselves a left opposition to the People's Socialist Unity Party, which is the party that's in power. And some of them talked about that. They said they thought that Maduro government should have ended that because they were violent and they were hurting the people. And Maduro said no. He says they will burn themselves out and the people will turn against them. And the one party that we spoke with, the Communist Party of Venezuela, who considers itself a left opposition, said, in the end we decided that Maduro was right and we were wrong. And they did burn themselves out. It got down to the place where they had barricades in the street. People that were in the communities wanted to get from one place to the other, and they were charging them a toll. They were charging them money to support the opposition. And, so people that at some level might have supported them started turning against them, and they just withered away. But when the United States chose Guaido, they made a big mistake, in my opinion. Guaido's a real right-winger, and he'll do anything that the United States wants. He went to college in Washington, D.C. He went to the School of the Americas. He learned how to torture from the U.S. military. He learned all these kind of things, and he basically said, "I'll do what you want." And so they chose him. They knew he would fall through. But after the 23rd, when he came back in the country, and this was another thing that Maduro was criticized for, because he didn't arrest him. This guy did all this illegal activity, he didn't arrest him, let him go around. He gave a speech, and the speech said, we call upon the United States military to attack Venezuela. Now imagine someone that considers himself the president of a country calling upon a foreign country to attack his country. So the media said to him, well, an American bomb won't know the difference between an opposition supporter and a Chavista. And he says, well, we know that, but there will be collateral damage, but people have to sacrifice for the sake of freedom. And I think it lost them all support, because while we were there was internal fighting within the opposition. The guy that's supposed to be his vice president, who's the head of a much bigger party, started announcing he should be president and not Guaido. And they tried to do, while we were there, 2 opposition demonstrations that we tried to go to. The first one just did not materialize. Nobody showed up at all. The second one, this is part of it. What happened was they said they were going to go to a place and start a march. And they were going to go through a heavily Chavista area. That people saw that as a provocation. They thought that they were hoping that there would be some fighting or police activity or something that they could use against Maduro. And then they were going to go to the National Assembly building, which is also the Constituent Assembly building, and the thought was they might try to take it over. And so we went to the place where the demonstration was supposed to start, and got on the free subway, went up there, and when we got there were police all over the place. And one thing we noticed was there were these brigades of women police officers. So we asked one of the people there, why are there so many women police officers? Not only were they women police officers, brigades of women police officers, but they were the ones that were put up front. They were in the front. And they said, well, they expect this to be a provocative action, and women are better at pulling down the level of provocation than men. So they made a conscious thing to have these women police officers there. But we waited and nobody showed up. And after a while we noticed the news media was packing up and going. So we decided to walk down to where the National Assembly was to see what was going on there. And this is what we found. There were about 40 opposition people. One of the ways you can tell they're opposition is they dress in suits, the women wear high heels, they try to make a point that they are different than the common person in the street, many of them. And the people around the edge there were not with them. They were mostly Chavista supporters. In fact, that tent is a very common thing. They have these free speech tents all over where you can go and say what you want. They're put up, and they're Chavista supporters and argue political position or not argue. People gather around these things and do these free speech. That's what one of those things are. So these people are around just kind of watching them, sort of curious. And nothing was really going on. Nothing was really happening. So then this showed up. Now, the Chavista supporters, when we go to these big demonstrations, one of the things they do is they have these motorcycle groups that come and support these demonstrations. It's all done through social media. They say, it's going to be a demonstration here and meet here. They had heard it was going to be provocative and some people were going to try to take over the National Assembly building. So they had decided to come and surround the National Assembly building to make sure nobody was going to take it over. That's one view of them. Here's another view. It went on for blocks and blocks. And they went around and started, when they saw the small crowd, they just basically kept driving around the National Assembly building to make sure nobody was going to try to take it over. And the police all of a sudden saw this, and they saw the small group of opposition people. So the police took the opposition people behind a police line where they made some kind of statement. So it was very clear that the pendulum was swinging against the opposition while we were there. And these attacks and attempts at coups and attempts at bringing in the aid and people like Weidel saying we want an invasion of our country has turned a lot of people into we're going to defend our country. That is pretty much what we saw. We did tremendous amount of press. We had lots of interviews. They interviewed us on TV stations. They interviewed us in the streets. They interviewed us everywhere we went. We had press conferences, 3 or 4 press conferences during this period. And they were very widely shown. And then we were invited onto a show, and this is the audience of the show. It's a very interesting show. It's the most popular show in Venezuela. It's shown once a week, but it goes on for 5 hours. And everybody watches it. And it's what they do in the show. They do some entertainment. They have rap singers and people singing and some music and some comedy stuff. But mostly what they do is they go over the news of the week from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, from the different places. And so much of it is so obviously wrong that it in itself becomes a comedy. People laugh at the things that we're saying, but then they debunk each of these things. And it goes on for about 5 hours. They wanted us there. And then all of a sudden, they start saying, and we have our American friends here from the American anti-war movement. So I was the first one to be introduced. First we have Joe Lombardo from the United National Anti-War Coalition. Everybody cheers and I stand up and hold my fist in the air. And then we have Ajamo Baraka, and he stands up and holds his fist in the air. And from all the media that we had, we were noticed everywhere. When we were on that big demonstration, and I was most noticed, I'll tell you that. People would come up to us and thank us and shake our hands and want to have pictures taken with us and all this kind of stuff. So this was that one show we were on, and it went all over the country. When we came back, people were going around doing talks. Tonight there's a talk from Sarah Flounders and Ajamo Baraka, who are doing a talk right now as we're talking, doing a report back in New York City. There's been several others that have happened, and others will continue to happen. So we try to change the narrative, say what we saw, as opposed to what you're hearing. But on the 30th, we had a demonstration of March. We had a demonstration in Washington, D.C. This was the day before the demonstration. And the reason we're having a demonstration in Washington, D.C. originally was because NATO was coming to Washington, D.C. on April 4th. And April 4th, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaties Organization, perhaps led by the United States, the major war maker in the world, was coming to celebrate, quote unquote, their 70th anniversary. NATO was originally formed to try to, stop, as they said, the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union hasn't existed for a long time, but rather than NATO dissolving, NATO has greatly expanded. And it's expanded to Colombia now, which is a NATO partner, the first in Latin America, which is on the border of Venezuela. Trump is now calling for the right-wing government in Brazil to join NATO, which also is on the border with Venezuela. And it was pretty clear they were going to have on their agenda Venezuela and what that meant when they came there. But April 4th is also the day of the assassination of Martin Luther King. And it was also the date 1 year before, exactly 1 year before his assassination, that he gave his famous anti-war speech at Riverside Church called Beyond Vietnam, where he called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. Many people celebrate Martin Luther King these days, don't like to remember his anti-war side. They like to remember just the civil rights side. Because he was discouraged from taking a stand against war. And he knew he had to do it. He knew it was two sides of the same coin. And it's a lesson that we have to learn, we in the anti-war movement, how to relate to the domestic struggles and those who are doing the domestic struggles in the communities against police violence and immigrant rights, how they have to see that as part of an international struggle. It will strengthen both of us and it will make us move. So we decided we needed to protest NATO, but when Venezuela became in the crosshairs of the United States, we decided we had to also add a focus of hands off Venezuela. So we did. And so a number of the organizers were there for several days beforehand, including me. The demonstration was actually called UNAC, and we got word, all the diplomats from Venezuela have been thrown out of the country. This is a diplomatic house. It actually had some kind of military connotation. And what they did was they turned it over to right-wing Venezuelans who say they support Guaido. And most of them aren't in these places, aren't doing anything in them. The one exception is New York City, where some of the Guaido supporters actually are occupying the building, but the other buildings lay empty. But these right-wingers, they go to these buildings, and we got word they were coming to this building. And what they do is the U.S. gives them the key, and they go in, and they steal everything. So there was a group of right-wing Venezuelans who were loading computers and printers and televisions into their cars. The real difference between the Chavistas and the right-wingers is this. When we spoke to both, when you speak to a Chavista, they say, well, look what's happening. People have food now. They have food distribution for anybody that's hungry. It happens once or twice a month, the basic foods that they get. So you don't see hunger. People are getting food. They're getting free education. We have free health care for the first time. We have housing that we never had housing. For the first time, we can vote. We really feel part of the society. The whole society is being lifted up. That's the narrative you hear from the Chavistas. From the opposition is, oh, you can't buy anything, and we used to be able to go out and do this, and there's no opportunity in the country because the resources are being used for the most needy, not the people like in most countries like the United States. Resources go to the people who need it the least. But they're going to the most needy. So in one case it becomes, you're lifting up society, in the other case it becomes an individual thing. So these individuals were taking the goods for themselves. So we had the numbers of the Venezuelan people in Venezuela, and we called up that guy that was the foreign minister. We called him up on the phone. He said, we're here at this building. They're taking the stuff out. And he said, tell them they can't do it, that it's Venezuelan property. It's our property by international law. It's illegal for them to take the stuff out. Tell them they can't do it. So we stood in front of the house to try to stop them. But the police came and kicked us off of the property and let them continue to steal. So the police aided the thieves. And the people that were there to say no to the thieves were not aided. And as we were starting the demonstration, we brought some of the flags in front of the White House because we we rallied in the park across from the White House and then marched through D.C. while it was the Cherry Blossom Festival, so there were lots of people who saw us. No news media from the United States. Tons of news media from outside of the United States. But nobody in the United States even heard that we had a very large demonstration, and not just a demonstration, a series of conferences and rallies, and everywhere that NATO went when they tried to speak to a joint session of Congress, we were outside. When they tried to, I guess I don't have some of that, when they tried to have their meeting, we were outside, and but no U.S. media picked it up at all. And in the Congress of the United States of America, they took a vote on whether to support NATO as a force for good in the world. Every single Democrat voted for it, including the ones that call themselves socialist, and most Republicans voted for it. So our Congress said on NATO's 70th anniversary, go right ahead, more war, we're all for it. The anti-war movement is a movement now that has to be separate from the two political parties. There's no longer an anti-war wing in the Democratic Party. It has to be an independent movement, and I hope you'll join us in that movement. We need to build a movement against the sanctions, and we need to do what we can, because Venezuela can very well be the Vietnam of this generation. We have to make sure that it's not. Thanks. Let's just do 1, 2, 3, all right?
The city, what city was that you standing in front of to try to keep the thieves away?
Washington, D.C.
D.C.
Yes.
Yeah, regarding the elections, Jimmy Carter has a mechanism where he evaluates them. So they were the most fair, in the world, actually.
There were people from all over the world who were observers of that, and they actually put out a statement opposing the United States, saying that is now something from the United States, no official observers.
Could you use a microphone, please?
But anti-war activists were. Is this on? Yeah. And so he said Jimmy Carter Center had validated that there were fair elections. This man, I believe, was next, and I'll work over here.
I have a million questions, but first a comment.
Just keep it to 100,000.
First of all, I heard that 2018 elections. They didn't.
Can't hear you.
I'll repeat it. Just say it, and I'll repeat
I
it.
had heard that in this most recent election, they didn't have the international observers that they had previously. I don't know if that's true or not. My other question is, right now there's HR 1004 in committee. Does that have any chance of having a piece to it, even if it gets passed?
I think I know it as a different bill number if you're talking about the same one. What bill are you talking about?
It's basically clawing back authorities that take military action in Venezuela.
Oh.
HR 1004.
Yeah, I don't know. I doubt that has any
It's in
chance
committee now.
in our
If it
Congress.
passed, I
Yeah.
don't know.
His other question was about elections. He said in the 2018 election, which is the last election, where Maduro got a very sizable majority, and also in all the local elections that took place around the country, Maduro people swept them pretty much. Not in all of them, but in a lot. He said that there were not international observers, which is not true. There were, Jimmy Carter Center was not there for the recent ones. They were there for the past ones. They were pressured not to go. There was pressure put on a lot of the countries that the U.S. has influence with not to go. And so a lot of them did not go. But then there were other countries that don't fall into the pressure of the United States that were there, and there were international observers. And I know some Americans that were down there and were observers. They have a politics similar to mine, but that's not true of all the observers that were there. Yes, and then who else had their hands up? Two, let's do those two and then we'll go.
Recently, the foreign minister that we met was at the UN, and he gave a press conference, and he was asking for peace in Venezuela, and he was flanked by by Russia, China, Pakistan, a whole group of countries, Nicaragua. So I'm wondering if it's possible that this isn't going to be a shoe-in for the empire this time, just given that there's such a large coalition of countries that are standing, including two UN Security Council members. So could this not pan out like it has in the past?
I think it won't pan out for many reasons. I mean, first of all, you've got to look at the United States and Afghanistan. That's the longest war the United States has ever been, started in 2001. It's now 2019, so 18-year war. And today, the Taliban has more property than the government. It hasn't gone they haven't been very successful. That was one of the poorest and weakest countries in the world. And the opposition to the U.S. invasion and occupation was not a very popular opposition. Where in Venezuela, it's a very popular opposition, and he's armed the people. If he was a dictator and corrupt, usually you don't arm the people. You don't usually call them out in the streets to demonstrate. But so they would have a very difficult time taking over in Venezuela. But more than that, the United States has a whole history of intervention into Latin America with coups, with military interventions, all sorts of interventions. There's very few countries in Latin America where we haven't intervened in. We used to have a name for it. It was called gunboat diplomacy. You know, you do what we say, we send in the gunboats, and we, do what we're going to do to you. So there's opposition against Yankee imperialism all throughout Latin America, even in the right-wing countries. So, like this guy Bolsonaro and Brazil, he says, sure, we'll support you against Venezuela, but we can't support you in an invasion. And none of them really can, because they know it would stir up opposition in their own country, and really it will inflame the entire region in ways that the United States is not wanting to see. The other thing is, if you think of Iraq, or if you think of Vietnam, they were halfway around the world. There wasn't a very big Iraqi population in the United States. There wasn't a very big Vietnamese population. Afterwards, some of the right-wing Vietnamese came into the country, and that's why we have some Vietnamese communities now, and a number of them have, their politics have changed, in my opinion, in a good way. But there is a huge Latino population, and a politicized Latino population in the United States. And it could cause disruption in the United States, not just a little anti-war movement, but much, much more. And so, not just that, the border wall stuff that's going on, that came from U.S. intervention and the coup that we supported in Honduras and in Guatemala, and that's where the people are coming from. The president of Honduras, his brother is the major drug lord, and he has these gangs that go around and intimidate people and kidnap people if they don't give them money and kill them. And so they're frightened, and they leave, and they come here, and then we have a wall, and what's his name? Yellow-haired guys. Trump. Trump in his wall. Says you can't come in. We're full up. We're not very full up, but it's our policies doing it. If we do this in Venezuela, there'll be a Venezuelan invasion too. It's going to inflame, and the Latino population that's opposed to these wars and opposed to sending immigrants back and the harsh activity of separating families, it could cause lots and lots of problems. I don't think they're in a very good position for a military invasion. However, Trump is there, and Trump tends to have his own mind and do what he wants. And if he does do that, I believe it will be a bridge too far. And I believe it's going to lead to a whole political upsurge will happen in this country. However, the sanctions are really hurting, They can't get medicine. I was down there for a week extra, and I take some meds. And so I ran out of them. So, because I was their guest, they got me the meds that I needed. And I felt terrible, because I saw on the TV there were people who were advertising, I've run out of this medication. Does anybody have it? Can they get it to me? Here's how you contact me. They were facilitating ads like that in the media to try to get spread around as much as they could. They have put clinics in all these poor areas. In almost every block there's a clinic now, and Cuban doctors are supporting them in these clinics. But they don't have the medicine, and they can't get the diagnostic instruments because of the sanctions. The trade, it should be a rich country. They have so much oil and other kinds of minerals, and the trade's being blocked everywhere it can, and things are being frozen. You can't trade with France, for instance, because the French banks cannot take a check from Venezuela, and a check written to Venezuela from a company that goes to a French bank can't write a check to Venezuela. So it's almost impossible to trade. It's very, very difficult. But what's happening now, there are so many countries sanctioned that they're starting a new group within the United Nations called sanctioned countries to try to figure out how they can increase trade among themselves and the countries that aren't supporting this trade, China and Russia and Iran and other countries, and seeing what they can do. So in the long run, that could backfire too. Yes.
That's my question about the United Nations. About a month ago, there was an NPR radio report that there was some United Nations initiative to broker negotiations in Venezuela leading to new elections. I was wondering, I don't know if it's true, but do you know anything about that?
There were negotiations. They took place between the opposition and Chavista and Maduro government in Cuba. And they were about to sign an agreement that could have taken people away from the brink. And the United States told them to leave the negotiations and not sign any agreement. And they did. The opposition left the negotiations. So it's possible there could be negotiations. Negotiations would be better than war. But I don't know. How many negotiations have there been on Syria? How many negotiations have been on, and where have they gone? I mean, it really comes down to, at the very end, the relationship of forces on the ground, and whether or not all parties are going to abide by them. Did the United States abide by the Iranian agreement? How many agreements have we withdrew from? And we have a president who doesn't feel you should abide by any agreements if it doesn't put America first. So anyway, one and then two.
Joe, Fred Pfeiffer from Malden. I've been very upset about the sanctions and the threats of violence from Venezuela, so I wrote a letter to our Congressman Paul Tonko a few weeks ago, and I got a page letter back, and he seems to be buying into these distortions and giving some sort of tacit approval to Trump's sanctions and to Gatto's legitimacy, and he sort of paints that picture in this letter without coming out too strongly, but it's there that he's going to go along with this and basically saying that he's supporting H.R. 1004, prohibiting unauthorized military action in Venezuela Act, but that's not to say he wouldn't support the action if it came to a vote. So if anyone's interested in looking at this letter, I have a copy here. And if anybody's interested in going to see Paul, because he has an open door policy, come on over. I think that everybody here should call his office at least and tell them what you heard tonight. And urge him to reconsider this. Anybody who wants to set up a meeting can see me after the meeting, and maybe we can then send a delegation. We're going to have a broad group of people from different localities, because I think that he is somebody we can't influence, but it's very disappointing that the Democrats are going along with this war mongering. I think Joe's right that the anti-war movement has to be anti-war, not supporting one party or another.
Well, I think in 2020 elections, you won't hear anything about war. They pretend that there's no wars.
Yeah.
And about 62% of every tax dollar now goes to the military. So you can't do very much else, So I'm sorry, were you next? Yes.
Yeah, I realize the U.S. is probably the leader of the team of nations that is establishing these sanctions against Venezuela, but does anybody have a list of these nations and who they are, and are they all associated with NATO, or is there a clump of nations that are sanctioning Venezuela? Is it just the U.S. and Russia? I'm not sure.
No, Russia is not sanctioning the United States. Russia is not sanctioning. Russia does not support sanctions. China does not support sanctions. Most of the European countries support the sanctions. The United States does. But if you look at the United States and Europe, those are the major markets of the entire world. Most of Africa does not support the sanctions. Latin America is kind of divided. Mexico does not support the sanctions. Bolivia does not support sanctions. Uruguay does not support the sanctions. So, it's, but the major markets.
Who's the ringleader of the sanctions?
The United States. United States.
When did they start, Joe? When did they sanctions start?
Well, they started actually under Bush. Then they were greatly accelerated under Obama. And then they were greatly accelerated a couple of times under Trump.
And for what reasons under Obama?
You gotta ask Obama. But I'll tell you why I think is this. We instigated a coup in 2002. We actually had kidnapped Chavez. We're putting him on a plane, and the military and the population just rose up, grabbed him off the plane, put him back. The opposition that the U.S. had chosen was in the presidential palace. They were smoking cigars. It was all videotaped. The U.S. ambassador came to visit them, and the people swept them right out. And the coup was ended. So it's been going on for a while. And my opinion is because they don't like the fact that the oil, when the oil was first discovered, the Venezuelans for their oil got 3% of the profits for their oil. 97% went to foreigners, mostly from the United States. And then they wanted their oil to be used for their own benefit and for the people's benefit, and they nationalized the oil. And that sent people crazy. And then all these social programs that were started under Chavez. But Chavez was so popular that when he died in 2012, I believe the government of the United States thought this is an opportunity. We could say, okay, Chavez was good even though we tried to overthrow him, but Maduro is bad. And we'll paint him as a dictator, we'll paint him as corrupt. And at that point, they upped the sanctions to make it more difficult for the people. So they were hoping that the people who supported Chavez would go against Maduro. That's why I think that they were greatly increased at that particular time. And then under Bush, he's made it very clear. Both Bush and Bolton have said, why are we fighting in these countries overseas? Venezuela is right in our backyard, and look at all the oil they have. They have made it very clear, we want to steal their oil. We are no better than thieves. They've made it very clear. And American people can't go along with it, and yet so many people do. They buy into the propaganda that, well, maybe we shouldn't invade them because that's not a good thing to do, but look, he's a corrupt dictator. The reason that the main carrier that goes from the United States to Venezuela, which is U.S. Airlines, canceled its flights and said it was because of chaos in Venezuela, and we saw no chaos in Venezuela whatsoever. Even during the blackout, there weren't people like might happen in a blackout in this country. People smash store windows and try to take things. It didn't happen, because people lived in those high-rise buildings, and the elevators stopped working, and the water pumps stopped sending the water up to the people gathered together at the base of those buildings, and these organizations of people's power got the water and got them in buckets. People walked up to the elderly and made sure, and it almost turned it into a festival in some places. We were on a street where, during the day you could see, but the traffic lights aren't working and things like this. But at night, there's nothing, it's dark, but the moon and the stars, and some people have flashlights and lanterns and things like this. And Some blocks turned it into a party. Everybody came downstairs and they had a festival and people were playing music and they were dancing and they were cooperating in a way that was different than you might see in this country. And that's a terrible example.
New York City had like really good in their pockets.
In most cases, people are people. People want to help each other. You know, we saw this during our hurricanes and things. And learned later some of them were charging people, but that's another story. And the government should have done it, and the government should have encouraged it, but they didn't. People came because people don't want to see people hurt. They don't want to kill people. They want to have an affinity to people. That's why we are human beings with human nature that has things that connect us to each other, like empathy and love. That's who we are. Anybody else? Yes, let me get people who haven't spoken first.
Mark Manley, I just wanted to note about humanitarian aid. Solidarity in Poland was genuinely popular, but the Central Intelligence Agency was able to infiltrate $20 million worth of printing presses, radio gear, and just cash into Poland during that period through the Catholic Church, in part, and that contributed to the overthrow of the government in Poland. And the other example I want to give quickly was U.S. provided food aid to the Pol Pot regime in Thailand. After the Vietnamese threw them across the border, the genocidal Pol Pot regime was able to access food aid provided by the CIA at jungle dump sites. They'd bring in the food, and Pol Pot's commanders would then control that, which meant in turn they controlled all the civilians who they brought with them out of Cambodia.
If the U.S. is interested in humanitarian aid for people, they should start with Yemen, where they and their allies are causing the worst famine that the world has seen and causing disease. And we still blockade the U.S. military. They can go many places they could see it. If they're against repressive governments, they should go to Saudi Arabia, where in 1 month they chopped off the heads of 40 people because they committed crimes such as converting to Christianity or protesting the government or, things that are what they just recently did to the guy in the embassy where they chopped him up. There's plenty of places they could do it, but they don't do it. USAID once went into Cuba not too long ago. You might remember what they did. And they started a Twitter type of service there. And once they got a critical mass of people on their Twitter feeds, they sent out a message to everybody into the streets to oppose the government. Well, nobody came into the streets, and the government understood what USAID was really doing there. They weren't doing something good for the people. If they want to help Venezuela, you don't send in food because they don't have a food problem. You send in medicine. But medicine is what hurts them, and they would never send in medicine because they want them to be hurt. It kills people. There are people dying because they don't get medicine. It's a war crime. And yet we don't do it. We just...
Did you go to Syria?
No, I didn't go to Syria. We just denied a visa to someone from the World Court because he was coming to the United States to investigate war crimes that the U.S. has been associated with in Afghanistan. So we denied him a visa. We denied her a visa. We're not interested in humanitarian anything. We are interested in power and wealth. That's what our country is all about, and I don't think that's what the people of the country are all about. And that's why we can change it. John.
Yeah, people should know that Arnold August, who spoke at the James Connolly Forum on the Cuban elections in 2016 and also came back recently to talk for the Cuban Solidarity Committee. He's a Canadian journalist, author, written a number of books on Cuba, and he was planning to go to the protest in Washington from Canada. He was stopped by the United States at the airport from going to the United States. And they cited some arrests that he had in the 1970s when he was young, ostensibly, which were political in nature. which it never stopped them from coming here before. So people should be aware that our government is on a censorship campaign to stop information like this getting out. It really is true.
But you should go to Venezuela. There's going to be another tour. There's another tour there now, which friends of mine are on. There's going to be another one on May Day. May Day is going to be really interesting. I know some people here might be going to the May Day one, but Venezuela May Day one, you're going to see the entire population in the streets. I mean, and they wear red. Oh, so you see them everywhere. You know, all down the avenues and the side streets and the buildings and out of the windows, and you're going to see them everywhere. It's going to be a gigantic demonstration because of the period that we're in, and the people are just ready to defend their process. Yes?
What's the Germans' excuse for going along with the U.S. sanctions?
What's the Germans' excuse for being in NATO? Germany is a country which is kinder and nicer than the United States. Most countries in the world are. But they're still a capitalist country. You know, they don't want to see the examples of this. And you're under the pressure from the United States. The United States economy is so big. The United States wealth is so big, and its military is so big. And we have so many military bases in Germany that we have a influence. Some of them, they go against the worst aspects of it, but they. And you know, the other thing is, like Cuba. If a boat goes to Cuba to trade stuff, it can't come into a U.S. port. It's the same thing. They sanction the companies that do the trade. They say if you do that, you can't trade with us, and they don't want to do that. And any government is trying to defend its economy and its corporation, especially a capitalist government. And so there's a lot of pressure that the U.S. can bring to bear. Yes.
Talk a little bit about the tour do you guide these places? Go anywhere or go in Morocco? Second, are there still American companies functioning in Venezuela? So like before they come out, you know, are they able to use pharmaceuticals?
Yeah. So our tour was limited. It was only going to be 1 week, but it ended up, for me, I was the last one to leave. It ended up 2 weeks for me because of the plane cancellations. We were just in Caracas and the outskirts of Caracas. There was one person from our delegation, a woman, who decided to stay on her own to travel to other parts of the country. As I said, it wasn't a government-sponsored tour, but the government kind of opened their doors and said, tell us where you want to go and we'll make it happen. It was organized by this group called COSI. They basically support the process that is there. We defined our own agenda, where we wanted to go, when we wanted to go. There were times we just up and went. People just walked around the neighborhood, took the subway where they wanted to go. So I took the subway to where the demonstration was going to happen, the opposition demonstration, and the actual people that were our host told me, I don't think you should do that. And I said, well, why? He said, well, you're very recognizable from all the media, and if the opposition sees you, you could be in danger. So me and the woman that stayed, Eva Bartlett, decided we were going to try it. And we felt comfortable at that point because we had been through all the streets and everybody was supporting us. Everybody was coming up to us who knew, who had seen us on TV and press conferences and were supporting us. And we felt kind of comfortable over there. And we thought that that would be the same thing. And I was envisioning that if I have to stay 50 yards away or 50 feet away, I could see what was going on and talk to the periphery, I could do that. But it didn't even have to happen that way. And so we only were in Caracas. Now, Caracas is the biggest city, but the guy that was our interpreter from COSI, he's actually from Scotland. And he, 17 years ago, moved was in Venezuela, marrying a Venezuelan woman and ended up moving there. And he lives near the Colombian border, and he lives in a place where he says the opposition is strong. And so didn't see places where the opposition was really strong, but he tells me it was strong there. He also was able to tell us some things about Colombia and Venezuela, because in Colombia, healthcare is expensive. In Venezuela, it's free. So every day, there's large amounts of Colombians coming across the border for healthcare in Venezuela, and they give them the healthcare. In fact, there is a community of 5 million Colombians that have permanently settled there. You hear about Venezuelans leaving, but you don't hear about the other way. And they're very strong Chavistas. A lot of them ran from the drug lords and the drug gangs and the violence that was happening a few years ago in Colombia. So I just know what I know. I don't know everything, and and on corporations, yeah, I did see American corporation logos. When we passed one, which was Dunlap, we were told that it's now nationalized, because Dunlap stopped making tires because they didn't want to support the revolution, so they took it over and made their own tires. So there are still U.S. corporations, and the predominant aspect of the economy is capitalist. But they're trying to use their wealth for the people, better people, and their major resource, oil, is nationalized. I'm sorry, yes?
As you know, the treatment of Venezuela in U.S. press has been terrible across the board, even NPR and outlets like that.
Yep, absolutely.
Unless you look for maybe the Intercept or something like that, you're not really going to get the full story. Is UNAC trying to get the word out?
Well, as best we can, you know.
And as a corollary, are you planning more demonstrations?
Yes, we have most of the anti-war groups in the country, some of those that you saw there, as well as Code Pink and others, were involved in demonstrations in DC, and tomorrow night we'll have an assessment of how it went. And what UNAC will propose is that we stay together in whatever format, loosely through UNAC, not through UNAC, to work on Venezuela, and we're going to propose in particular that we start working on the sanctions and let people know how the sanctions hurt and what they really mean, and try to get that in focus, because the U.S. is using that so much these days all over the world. Let's take one more, and then I think we're going to...
Roger Waters of Pink Floyd wrote a song for Venezuela. You can go on YouTube and hear the old folk song. I don't think it was with Marco Rubio. Actually, Marco Rubio knew about the blackout instantly after it happened.
He knew about the blackout instantly. He was the first person who knew about it.
So
he knew about it before the Venezuelans knew about it.
Yeah, he had 4 dollars, so just saying.
All right, thank you all, and